Horatio Nelson, 1st Viscount Nelson, 1st Duke of Bronte, Britain's God of War. The last, of course, is a paraphrasing of Professor Lambert's book on the subject. And it's a worthwhile reading. It is worthwhile reading, even though it sits on my shelves with about another dozen other books about Nelson. And the thing is, the reason it's worth reading is because it gets into the leadership of Nelson. And he is very much a British god of war. He has his achievements, he has his successes, he has his failures. He learns from both. And that is the thing about British naval history and British history in general. We tend to learn as much from our successes as our failures. We learn from what we did right when we won, and what we did wrong when we won, and what we did right when we lost, and what we did wrong when we lost. Because the odds are, you didn't lose because you made the wrong decision every single time. You probably made enough wrong decisions that you lost. And it's like when you win, you probably made enough correct decisions that you won, but you probably still made some bad decisions in it. There are battles and pieces of history like that throughout history. And that's why it's always important when you're studying these points in history, when you study people's history, to go into it without... It's going to sound strange, without putting them up onto a pedestal of hero worship. They make mistakes. If I give an example of me, I often talk about Admiral Henderson, 3rd Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, 1933 to 1939. The mistake I feel he made was he didn't have a deputy. He didn't push enough to have a deputy to pass on. So his information, that's the really big mistake he meant. So that meant that when he did die in 1939 through overwork and various illnesses induced by that, there is a drop in the capability of the 3rd Sea Lord Office to fight and argue for the Navy and the needs of what ships need. And that's one of the reasons why you have all the troubles and decisions which Churchill makes. Is realistically, as Churchill comes in as a very powerful political operator, he has this idea based on his World War I experience of what the Navy needs to be doing, and he isn't going to be dissuaded from that, because the people who are operating with him are mostly the people who've had to take over the positions at last minute because they've died. The people holding those positions have died. They've lost the 1st Sea Lord, they've lost the 3rd Sea Lord, all these people through death. And so you've got basically an inexperienced team trying to deal with an experienced political operator, and they're not sure how to manage him, and that's where some decisions go wrong, because they're not sure how to combat him, how to debate with him, how to be good interlocutors with him. And that's where a lot of those decisions go wrong. Okay, that happens. And that can be put back to, well, Henderson didn't have a deputy who he trained up to the level at which he could immediately jump into his position. He didn't have someone like that. He'd considered it, he'd pushed for assistance, he'd pushed for support. They hadn't given them to him. So they're not there. That is something Henderson, considering the political power he has, he could have done. Now, why am I talking about Henderson when I should be talking about Nelson? Well, the reason is Henderson is someone you probably haven't heard about unless you watch this channel a lot, because he isn't one of the people who's talked about a lot in the run to war, because he dies in 1939, and so a lot of people then just forget about him and move on to other pieces of more interesting bits of history of the people who actually do fight in the war. With Nelson, often his mistakes are pinned into things which, how do I put this politely, are easily written off. Like, oh yes, he was a great admiral, but he was terrible at politics. He was a great admiral, but he was terrible with affairs of the heart, and all these things. And the thing is, he was a human. He was both good and bad at politics. He was good and bad at affairs of the heart. And he was a great admiral, but sometimes also he made mistakes. One of the things we're going to talk about is he earns a lot of experience doing amphibious warfare, and that makes him overconfident when it comes to the big battle that he actually commands in amphibious warfare, and he completely flubs it. He does. He makes errors which you can only make through overconfidence. And he realizes this, and recovers from it. And then when he's doing battle again in future, he acknowledges it. Now that is far better, a far more human, but also a far more understandable and useful story to learn from than the idea of this person was born great, they were always great, and they died great. Because one is an unachievable ideal by anyone, because it's decided whether you're born that great or not. The other one is, this is a person who was born in quite tough circumstances. He managed to pull himself up with the assistance of family. I've already done a video about Maurice Suckling and his uncle and his role in that. He pulled himself up, he was hard-working, he was committed, he did a lot of effort and a lot of application and a lot of thought about what he was doing, and he became great through the application of effort, through the hard work he applied. And yes, he made mistakes, but he learned from them and he got better. And to me, that is a god of war. That is someone who I want to learn from. I can't learn perfection that's decided if I'm born perfect or not. I can learn from someone who learns from things and develops themselves. And that is Nelson. He learns. Does he always get the right thing? No. In fact, I would say he's a very good wartime admiral, but oh my lord, do you not want him in command of things in peacetime? Because he has two modes. Doing nothing or doing everything. He doesn't have an in-between gear ratio set. He's either going at full power or he's doing naught. And the trouble is, that's kind of like using your police as riot squad to do your normal patrol, or to do normal patrol duties. It's a case of, they're not really the kind of presence on the beat that's going to keep things how we'd like them. They're going to give the impression of a police state, which can cause other issues. We'd rather not have them. They're complicated in a democracy. So it's the same with him in peacetime. But his first combat, that comes relatively early in his career. Now, after getting into the service, into the Navy, being sponsored after his mum had died by his uncle, his mum's brother, who basically had lost his own wife, and for that reason, when he saw his brother-in-law going to pieces, he and her other brother basically divided their kids between them and said, I will sponsor this half, you sponsor that half, and we'll make sure they get a set up as well as we can for life in honour of our sister. It was really a kind of thing of, our sister's dead. We owe it to her, we will make sure her kids do okay, because our brother-in-law is currently falling apart. Okay. It was understandable. They'd had a very, very loving relationship and apparently been very connected. So, husband was falling apart and they stepped up. But Suckling was a very senior officer in the Royal Navy. He might have been only a captain, but he'd served as controller. He had all sorts of capabilities, and if he'd lived longer, would probably have gone on to become an admiral and been a very, very senior officer in the Royal Navy. And he was very connected. And in those days, patronage worked not as we necessarily imagine it. We often imagine patronage in terms of the worst form of, oh, this isn't the better my child, I'll promote this one. Even though they can't do the job, I'll promote them. No. You have to remember, patrons, their power to be patrons depend on their position. Their position depended on them looking good and being capable of doing the operations. So as a naval officer, if you promote people who are related to you, but who are stupid and are going to look bad, you then look like an idiot, and you find yourself with, how do I put this, not getting enough sea time. Because if you don't get enough sea time, it's very difficult for you to rise in the ranks. It's very difficult for you to get on to become an admiral. Even if you do, you might be given an admiralty in the yellow, in which case, well, the yellow squadron is basically retired. Oh, you've been promoted to admiral? Yes, and permanently taken off to sea duty. So you've got no chance of advancing, no chance of becoming anything better. You were on half pay as a rear admiral sitting ashore somewhere. And the amount of time that happened because someone's, how do I put it this politely again, the people you're patronising, the people you're supporting, have caused problems. Many a career was dashed because they applied their patronage to people who were undeserving of it. One point, if you look at one point in history, it's almost the leading cause of officers who should be getting to admiral, not getting to admiral. Because you look at them going, there's no other failing they have other than, oh, this lieutenant they promoted actually turned out to be a coward. Oh. Turned out to be useless, got his ship wrecked. Oh. And how does Morris avoid this with his own nephew? Well, the moment he's got him under his command, he also helps him go out and do various things. Suckling's in charge of the Nor guard ship, HMS Triumph, but he gets Nelson to go off on West Indiaman, the Mary Ann. He gets him to go off on all sorts of other ships whenever he can to get experience. And one of those ships was HMS Seahorse. She was going to sail out to the East Indies. So he sailed for the East Indies in 19th of November 1773 and arrived at Madras in the 20th of May 1774. They cruised for most of that 1774 off that coast, and when the Anglo-Maratha War broke out, well, the Seahorse was part of the fleet sent to support the East India Company, and she ended up took a cargo of the company's money actually to Bombay at one point, which earned her and her crew the love of the East India Company, because they like it when you're moving their money around. And in 1775, on the 19th of February, they actually engaged in action with two of Hyder Ali's ketches, small vessels. And they decided to attack the Seahorse, which was probably not a sensible idea, because the Seahorse, as small as she is, and I do admit she is incredibly small, and really I'm not really sure how she counts as a 648 frigate, but she does. Technically she counts as a 608 frigate, is therefore a post ship. She had 22 9-pounder guns and 2 3-pounder guns on her. So, yeah. Not much in terms of firepower, but enough. And that's, on the 19th of February, 1775, is Nelson's first experience of battle. And as far as we know, during it, the still 16-year-old Nelson acquitted himself admirably. He was commanding a gun crew, he was running around the ship, he was doing all the things that a young midshipman, would be expected to do. And he did it well. And as such, by the time he gets back in 1777, he's able to take the exams for his lieutenant's position, which is in front of a board which consists of John Campbell, Abraham North, and Maurice Suckling, 3 captains. Now you might think again, the uncle would be careful about being involved on board. It could be seen as problematic if he passes his own nephew. Actually, in a way, it's even harder on Nelson. Whilst he is getting in a young age and slightly underage, he does have the experience to pass his exams for lieutenant. For the uncle, as senior as he is, if Nelson didn't stand up to questioning and they put him through a full ringer of questions, then he would have to cut him in a way which would help. He probably moved him off to the dockyards. He's connected with the controller's office already at this point, and he could move him off to the dockyards and find a position in the dockyards. He can get him out of the Navy. This is his opportunity if he's going to make him look bad. And it's a direct opportunity. So, as nephew and as protege who he's promoting, he will be doubly in trouble with his career if Nelson turns out to be a dud. He doesn't, so he gets promoted to lieutenant, and he gets to go off and get more experience, and that's important. Now, as a lieutenant, he ends up going out to the Jamaica station aboard HMS Lowestoft, under command of Captain William Locker. Now, this leads to what is probably one of the more interesting points in his career, and something I want to think about. Lowestoft does so well in the American War of Independence that she starts her own franchise. Yes, she captures enough ships that some of the ships she captures, she turns into ships which will also go out capturing prizes. One of those is a vessel called the Little Lucy. Now, you might be wondering, why am I talking about the Little Lucy? Well, the Little Lucy was Lieutenant Nelson's first command, first time being in charge, and at some point when he was taking prizes or doing a cruise of the Caicos Islands, etc., where he's doing some science operations, etc., assisting various people, and earning himself the favour of Sir Peter Parker, he'll be taking a prize, and will be shouting out to his crew, to his men, "Come on, my little Lucies! Have at them!" And for some reason, the thought of Nelson shouting out that just brings a smile to my face. But he does really well. He gives lots of glowing reports of this. This is his first command. And think about this. He's 19 years old. He's 19 years old, and he is leading his own ship in battle, in combat operations. He is taking advanced decisions. And he's doing that because, frankly, he's been trained to from a very, very young age. He's 6 years into his naval career, and he's commanding ships, and is doing some interesting work with that. He really is. Now, as things get more interesting, well, he's been recommended to Sir Peter Parker, who took Nelson to his flagship, HMS Bristol. And that meant that when the French entered the war, well, there were real targets of opportunity now. And there are lots of prizes going on. Nelson, by 1778, was earning £400 a year or more in prize money, with Parker appointing him as master and commander of various vessels, including HMS Badger. Now that's a great role. And again, earning him a lot of money. £400 in 1778 is a fair chunk of change. Unfortunately, and this is a very real thing, Nelson is not necessarily the best with money. He understands the concept of you have to spend money to make money. And the things naval officers have to spend money on is entertaining their junior officers, entertaining, when they're admiral, their staff, and these sort of things. And that is true. That is true. But as Rodney and Parker and a few others would tell you, you spend some money on that, but you set some money aside for things like buying a house, setting up a pension, supporting your wider family. You know, these sort of things. Nelson does that at points, but he's not very consistent with it. And I think that's mostly because Nelson is very much in the now character, in now personality. What he's seeing right now is what matters to him, what he's dealing with. This makes him very good for wartime command. This makes him very good as an officer. He's always in the moment. He's always thinking about this moment, next moment, couple of moments ahead. But it means that beyond that, well, that's something I'll deal with later. I've got this in front of me to deal with now. That's something I'll deal with later. He's more interested in figuring out the puzzle of what the French are up to, etc., and these things, than he is about necessarily dealing with the puzzle of what I'm going to do when I retire. How am I going to live? How am I going to buy myself a very nice bottle of claret whenever I need it? You know, the important things for a naval officer in this time period. And, well, Badger spends most of 1779 cruising Central American coast and going as far as Honduras and Nicaragua, and has some success, but it's sporadic success, but still does quite well in terms of prizes. When he returns to Port Royal, he finds that his captaincy is being posted. And he is hands over HMS Badger to Cuthbert Collingwood. Yes. One of the friends he's going to serve a lot with over the years. One of the two friends, of course, being the brothers, the Collingwood brothers. His new ship was the 28-gun HMS Hinchbrook. Certainly a decent-sized frigate. A very decently sized frigate. Hence you had to be posted. Your command of it would be posted. And with that, well, Parker was organising all his ships, and he was using Nelson. He actually, at one point, put Nelson in charge of Fort Charles, which covered the approaches to Kingston. When the French commander who was coming up the Stang decided to head north, and the invasion never actually happened, Nelson went back to Hinchbrook and sailed for Port Royal and started doing other duties. Principally capturing a lot of American prizes. Making some money. You know, he's a naval officer, he needs to make the money. And then he just carries on doing this. Now, Nelson starts in this period to get his issues with malaria, and this is one of the things. He gets malaria in 1779. His mum had died in 1767, but his uncle, Maurice Suckling, had died in 1778. And it's this starting bout with malaria that really starts to bring on the... I sometimes refer to it as the melodrama of Nelson, in that he's always thinking about his own mortality, and he's always convinced he's going to die at certain point. He jumps in and out of it. He'll be one moment convinced he's going to die, and then when he's not, I'm brilliant and I don't need any medical treatment. He's that kind of personality. If he'll get in the mindset of I'm going to die, and then everything will be off and terrible, and and the moment he realizes he's not, then he's back full fighting fit and vigor. It's just, as I said, he is very much a 0 to 100 personality. And that fits with combat in this time period, that fits with his role, that fits what he's doing, as long as he's fighting, as long as he's got something to concentrate on. And well, with the malaria going around, and keep recurring bouts of it himself, he takes part in things like the capture of the Spanish colonies in Central America, and all those things under John Dawling's command, and, supporting amphibious operations, but that actual operation leads to roughly 2,500 personnel being lost to yellow fever. Nelson's praised for all he does. He does really well, supporting them. And the Navy does well. The Army doesn't do well ashore. There are discussions about why. And then Nelson gets command of HMS Janus, the 44-gun frigate. But unfortunately, later on, he now gets dysentery, which was possibly yellow fever as well, whilst in Costa Rica. And therefore he's unable to actually take command of the Janus. And so he's taken to Jamaica. He's doctored by Cuba Cornwallis, a lady who seems to be in some way connected, possibly mistress, possibly other things, to the Captain William Cornwallis, and runs a sort of lodging hospital, as it's called at the time, for sailors and naval officers. And then he's discharged to HMS Lion in August to return to Britain, and arrives in the UK in November, and by August 1781 has been well, I would say promoted, but put in charge of HMS Albemarle. He's been given command of her. She's another 28-gun sick freight, but it's a good thing to get command of. And it's kind of a promotion, because if you've been sicked off for that long, your career could be in the doldrums for years, but he's managed to carry it on. And if you think about it, in August 1781, he's still only 23. He's still only 23. Now, whilst in command of the Albemarle, he did a lot of, and I do mean this, a lot of cruising around, a lot of convoy protection, and even did an amphibious operation, which didn't go too well in the Turks Islands. But, he landed a force of 160 sailors and marines with a supporting bombardment from a flotilla of frigates he was in command of, that found that the French were heavily entrenched, is the phrase that most authors seem to use, and meant that the personnel couldn't go anywhere. But Hood, who was his commanding officer, this is Samuel Hood at the time, was rather happy with him because he was bringing in quite a few prizes, and frankly, who cares about a small failed amphibious operation? Not his first one, not his last one in his career. It is also during this period that he ends up meeting Fanny Nesbitt, who would later on go on to, of course, become his wife. She was a very lovely lady. She was a young widow, and frankly, it was a good match at the time. She was wealthy, he was a naval officer. This was a useful thing for him. But unfortunately for him is that wars don't continue forever, and when he finds himself in reserve on half pay and not able to get command, well, and I do mean well, he finds himself trying to get employment for his crew members and supporting family events and trying to do something. However, in January 1793, he gets Agamemnon. Now, if we think about this, at this point, she was only a 12-year-old ship. And he, in 1793, was a 35-year-old man. 35 years old. And he is now commanding a third-rate ship at the line, and it is quite a healthy number down the list of commands. It really is. It's quite a healthy number down the list of ships he's commanded. All good. Very good. And now he gets to really start to grow his experience and grow as a captain. And I would argue probably the best examples of that comes in the Battle of Saira and the operations in Genoa, which lead up to the Battle of Genoa in 1795. Now, originally, Hood, when he was commanding the Mediterranean, had sent Nelson to open diplomatic mission relations and things with the city-state of Genoa. That's quite normal again, a naval officer being sent for this. It's who you have available. They have linguistic skills normally, or at least the crew which will have them, and they are the roving representatives. This is the point I regularly try to make. Naval officers are far more often called to be representatives of their nation because of the fact they turn up with visible piece of that nation, its ship, than army officers. Army officers will be doing a lot when they're on campaign, if they're in a foreign country, or etc. They'll be on working with allies. They'll be doing a lot, very concentrated, but then they could be called home, and then they won't be doing it for years. Whereas for a naval officer, being a diplomatic representative is almost the bread and butter. It's what they do spend a lot of time in peace doing. It's what they spend a lot of time in their wartime doing, working with allies, communicating with allies, talking to people. And he does quite well in this. Okay, he's not the world's best diplomat. He is, in many ways, when it comes to diplomacy, a bit of a blunt instrument. But he does well. He does well. And when Hood returns to England, well, William Hotham comes out as the Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean to succeed Hood. Whilst this is going on, this changeover of command, Nelson gets Agamemnon repaired in Leghorn, and managed to, how do I put this, as usual, have local dalliances with Nelson. He does seem to pick up ladies wherever he goes. I'm not quite sure how he did it, because he is certainly one of the ultimate short kings, but he seems to be very successful about it. Very, very successful about it. When Hotham finally arrived in December 1794, Agamemnon is ready and they go on multiple cruises. And Hotham again starts to use Nelson as an independent commander, an independent operation. At certain points, Hotham dispatches Nelson off to deal with various things. He sends Nelson off to take part in what is basically a fleet action before a fleet action. The fleets were shadowing each other, the English fleet and the French fleet, the British fleet and the French fleet, in March 1795. And when a couple of French ships collided, well, Nelson managed to engage the 84-gun Saira. And for 2.5 hours, he pummels this ship. He pummels it. And let's be honest, a 64 gun versus an 84 gun, that should not be a fair fight. That should not be a victory. But it's looking very much like a victory until the French dispatch ships out of their line to go and try and force Nelson away. And this allows Hotham, in many ways, an advantage when it comes into the Battle of Genoa on the 14th of March. Because when they start attacking them, the Sarre, which is an important part of the French line, is actually under tow of the censure. And so both ships are actually damaged and forced to surrender. And Nelson is a little bit cheeky. Because the Sarre is in worse condition and is therefore maybe less likely to be brought into the Royal Navy. But the censure, well, she's a 74 gun third-rate ship of the line, a Pegasus class ship of the line, and well, he manages to grab her. He spent the previous day beating up the Sarah, and then this day, well, he took the censure because she looked in slightly better condition and he got a better price for her. You know, he's a sensible officer. And Agamemnon carries on being useful. Agamemnon is the ship which he takes into many, many battles and does really well with. It's only when she's sent back in June 1796 that he transfers to the captain, which of course he goes on to other operations in, both as a captain and later as a commodore. With that being said, though, Shameless Book Plug time. Now, Shameless Book Plug, where I go, thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow, and all those sort of things. It really does help the channel grow. And thank you for being so supportive. Thank you for making the trip to Japan possible. Thank you for everything. When this video goes live, if everything has gone to plan, I'll be contemplating my flight home from Japan. Touch wood, all will be good. All will be well. And thank you for making it all possible. Thank you for all your support. There is a November Historiathon coming up. There is going to be a live public talk in King's College London in November as well, and I hope to see as many of you there as can possibly be there, or watching online if you can. I can't be there in person, but thank you. Thank you for making all this possible, and thank you for being so kind and supportive. Now, Nelson first achieved Commodore while still aboard the Agamemnon. It was after John Jervis became Commander-in-Chief in the Mediterranean, and basically he decided, I need more people to command forces than I have admirals, so I'm going to take some of my better captains and make them Commodores. And so Nelson was leading a small force to basically spend his time off the Italian coast and the French coast causing issues. And he does this very well. Unfortunately, there's not really much that he can engage. He has a nice action on the 31st of May 1796 when he captures 7 small vessels in convoy. But realistically, how do I put this play? From the letters you get coming through, he's kind of frustrated that he hasn't got more to sink his teeth into. Remember, being a financial officer is an exercise in finances as well as it is in naval power in this time period, and realistically you need to be capturing a lot more beautiful game than what he's getting at this point. Anyway, in June 1796, Agamemnon has to go home, has to go back to Britain for repairs, and so Nelson is given the captain, HMS Captain. He quite likes her, and of course he has a flag captain and things to help him now. While he was Commodore aboard Agamemnon, it was interesting. Theoretically he does, but most of the time he has his first lieutenant is basically acting as a captain. Once you board captain, he does get a flag captain. It's useful. It gives him someone to talk to. That is the other thing about flag captains, chiefs of staff. Theoretically, being in command is a lonely position, and it is. It means all the buck stops with you. This is what I often point out when I'm judging commanders, etc. People go, well, they have this stuff to... they might have been ill, or they might have been this. And I go, well, doesn't really matter. You have thousands of lives depending on you. If you are in such a poor state that you should not you should not be consulted because it disturbs so you can recover, then you should have transferred command to someone else, or you should have your staff be able to do that for you. And by the way, a smart staff can come with 3 ways of getting you out. 1, they can be official and send official note. 2, they can have a communications malfunction. And 3, well, they can just send a message along the lines of currently commanding officer is indisposed, injured, indisposed, or the other phrase they can use is unable to exercise their role, so passing command temporarily to so and so. But usually you've got 2 options. The sending it up the chain of command to inform them, that causes trouble. Sending it down the chain of command can cause less trouble depending on what your subordinates like. Just having a communications malfunction, saying we've got problems, so we can't exercise the ship cannot exercise its role as flagship, so therefore we're having to pass flagship duties to another vessel until we can make repairs. That's the easiest, especially in modern warfare way to do it. And if you trace some battles, you can almost tell when the commanders have been hurt or ill, and the staffs have gone, do we tell everyone about this? That could cause issues. Let's just say we've got a comms issue. And so needs to take charge because of that. It's a common thing. But the reason they can do that is because the chief of staff is sort of like your best friend. They have to be your best friend. They have to be a relationship you have to form completely, very quickly, to pretty much be almost symbiotic level of they are your other you. When you are not in a room, they are you. Everything they are told, it's presumed you will be told. Everything you are told, they will be told. Because they are the continuity of effort. When you can't be in that room because you have to be somewhere else more important, but you still want that's what they're doing, what's being done is still very important, you have them do it. You have them organise your staff while you're off dealing the things you need to deal with. They have to be you. And when they're flag captain, they combine that role with flag captain, then that's a critical role. Because they are not just being that for you, they're also running a ship. Again, pretty much running a ship in your name. That's why it's not called it's called a private ship when there's no a senior officer aboard. When there's a senior officer aboard, it's not called a private ship. Because whilst the captain is master on the god, there is someone closer to God aboard the ship. So, in a nice way, I am the master on the god, but one of God's deputies is right there, so yeah. That's the scenario. That's how you have to think about these things. And with Captain, Nelson really starts to grow into strategic command. He does start to grow into strategic command, and Jervis is prepared to use him for all these things. We also start seeing the fruits of Nelson's own patronage, start to come through in this period. When the Spanish vessel, the Santa Sabina, a frigate, is captured by Nelson, he places it under command of Lieutenants John Culverhouse and Thomas Hardy. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't to be a long-lived command for them. They managed to take the Santa Sabina, but they then use the Santa Sabina to draw off some Spanish ships which are chasing the Minerva, which is the vessel that Nelson's on at the time, and they get captured. Nelson does manage to get them freed quite soon afterwards, and they're with him for the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, aboard Captain, when he, of course, does a manoeuvre which, well, if it didn't work, he would have been court-martialed. Let's be honest. The Battle of Cape St. Vincent, he breaks the line, he breaks the instructions, and wears the ship around to break off from the rear of the British line to head for the Spanish van, the front of their line. And is basically taking on an 112-gun vessel, the San Josef, the 80-gun San Nicolas, and the 130-gun Santa Trinidad, which is an interesting force when you consider he has a 74-gun captain, and eventually is assisted by the 74-gun HMS Culloden. I'm just going to point out here the broadside weight of... Well, you have basically a broadside of 74 guns on one side, on two bow ships, and then just one side of guns. One side of guns of the others, of the other force, and it's, let's see, it's 65, plus 57, and 40. So, by my count, that is 162 guns. Just point out that the weight of fire is more than twice against them. And yet, despite Captain Culloden being smashed up, Nelson manages to board the San Nicholas, and shouting Westminster Abbey, your glorious victory. That man is such a prima donna. Sometimes he really is. And when the San Josef attempts to come to the San Nicholas's aid, she gets caught up in the San Nicholas. So Nelson, of course, develops his patented boarding bridge of using the 80-gun San Nicholas to board the 112-gun San Josef, and manages to take both. He's made up some money, okay? Let's just leave that. He's made a lot of money. And the classic thing is, it was the first time in 300 years that a British flag officer had led a boarding party when this is carried out in 1797. Now, I don't think that's quite correct. That is an often quoted tagline of that, but I don't think it's quite correct. I think it's the first time someone has publicised that as, in a few hundred years, that they led a boarding party. However, if you read some of the accounts of senior officers and their ships taking ships in boarding actions, whilst the admirals might not be necessarily on the first wave across, they seem to be very, very close there the moment there is a surrender, almost as if they were in the second wave. Which, again, you might go, well, technically, therefore, that's correct. You know, Nelson led the boarding party, and that's technically correct, but also, in the nicest way, someone with that much gold braid should probably not be putting themselves in that level of danger. To quote it when we're talking about army officers, there is a reason why the two highest casualty rolls for their numbers in the army are always lieutenants and corporals. It's not sergeants, and it's not captains, and it's not colonels. It's lieutenants and corporals. Why? Because they're the ones expected to be leading from the front. That's what they do. They're the tippy point of the spear, the trainees. They're the ones who have that job. That's what they're given. The other people above that, they're kind of useful. You've trained them enough that they now have a value beyond just being a physical leader. They have to be a coordinator of force. They have to be, to an extent, a manager, an organizer, a logistician. And that means that whilst they need to be close to the tip of the spear, they need to be in a leadership role. They don't need to be at the tip of the spear. In fact, it probably mitigates against them doing their role correctly if they are. In this case, honestly, Nelson wasn't going anywhere. Captain was stuck. San Nicholas was stuck. His ship was severely damaged. Honestly, it's a Hail Mary play. It's, as he says, it's Westminster Abbey or victory. Glorious victory. It works. It works. I will say also that there is the words of Rear Admiral William Parker, who basically claimed Nelson had been supported by multiple ships, more than he acknowledged, and that San Josef had struck her colours by the time Nelson boarded her. But I would say there is a bit of a dispute, because it might have been the colours were struck, it might have been they were shot through, and they hadn't really... He's seeing it from a distance. I'd also say it's a kind of battle where people are milling around, and yes, there are more ships which get involved in long-term fight, but the two who are there the whole way through doing it are Culloden and Captain. So, Parker's not wrong, Nelson's not wrong. It's perspectives on an account of an operation. At a certain point, Parker, who's sitting back, can see everything else that's going on around him. Nelson is too busy probably using a sword and occasionally shouting for glory to his boys to actually be noticing that. And as after this, Nelson is promoted to Rear Admiral of the Blue. Now, and he is 38 years old? Let's be honest, it's 1797, but it's only February when he's promoted. February, just after the battle. And it's also considered it's unrelated to the battle, etc. But he's 38 years old. He's not yet even 39. He's been in the Royal Navy for, well, let's be honest, 25 years? Okay, so you can't exactly say he doesn't have the experience, hasn't got there by experience. But you also look at the other officers in his period, and there are quite a few of similar ranking period of service who are nowhere near getting to Admiral. So the point is, saying someone's promoted just because they've got their time. Well, he's got the time in service, he's got the seniority of experience, all those things, and they're not promoting him to the yellow. They're promoting him to the blue. Okay? It's pretty much the lowest they can go with a Rear Admiral rank. But it makes sense. Because, let's be honest, he's good, but no one's quite sure if he's good for peacetime or good just for war at this point. Jervis has turned into a bit of a fan. He's made him look very good in a battle. This does tend to make Jervis very, very happy. And, well, what happens as a Rear Admiral is not necessarily the greatest thing. You see, whilst, and I have talked a bit about this, Nelson has developed experience in amphibious warfare and fighting ashore and fighting land. He, however, does have a tendency to overplay or overestimate his ability when it comes to amphibious warfare. The Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife is a great example of this. It also happens in 1797. And in this battle, which takes place in July 1797, well, he wants to do a full bombardment by his ships and amphibious landing in a surprise attempt to take Santa Cruz de Tenerife. Now, for those who don't know, Santa Cruz de Tenerife is something the British have tried to take on a few occasions. This particular part of the Canary Islands is known for being a place that the Spanish treasure fleets like to come and visit, and the Royal Navy has long harboured a desire for it. And when I say long harboured a desire for it, they've made multiple attempts over the years. And their track record is not that good. In fact, if there is some place you want to look at to go, okay, maybe the Royal Navy is a bit overestimated in history sometimes, or over-egged up, Santa Cruz de Tenerife. Go have a look at that. Admittedly, it is a bit of a natural fortress. Admittedly, it is also just the right size that people continually underestimate. If we consider the force which Nelson turns up with, he has 4,000 soldiers and sailors combined. He has 3 ships of the line, a 4-freight, 3 frigates, a cutter, a bomb vessel, and that's it. To take on what are 1,700 regulars, militia, and sailors. That sounds not enough, does it? That really doesn't sound like enough. When they're organised, when they are prepared, when they're dug in, that is not enough. It's one of those things that happens. It's, usually the attacks on Santa Cruz de Tenerife are literally other British going, okay, we've won this big battle. We can now send a small squadron off to do this. If you want to do it properly. If you want to do it, turn up with enough force. But this is not what happens. Nelson goes off. He gets sent and, well, this is the battle where he shouts out, "Let me alone, I have yet legs left and one arm. Tell the surgeon to make haste and get his instruments. I know I must lose my right arm, and the sooner it is off, the better." After the battle, after his loss, he does. Right, a left-handed admiral will never again be considered useful. Therefore, the sooner I get to a very humble cottage, the better, and make room for a better man to serve the state. As usual, he jumps from one end of the extreme to the other. He's the 0 to 100 personality. This is what Nelson is. He is the 0 to 100 personality, and he's a good leader for it. But this battle required, if you don't get surprised, if you turn up and find them organized, then you need to do careful operations. You need to do bombardments. You need to slowly bring down the artillery. You then need to move from bringing down the artillery to making a breach in the wall. Then you need to make sure you secure a landing position for your troops. Get your troops ashore. Get them all marshaled up in force. You haven't got enough that you can afford, that you're going to be able to overwhelm your opponent, so you need to have made sure you've starved them a bit beforehand, so you've weakened them. And then once you're ashore, and then once you're well positioned, and then when everything's organised and logistics are placed, and you've got some artillery on shore to cover your approach, as well as the ships offshore providing bombardment, then you do it. And then you might have a chance. And you might be going, well, Alex, that sounds great in hindsight. You're saying that. No, this is what other operations have had to do in similar circumstances. This is how other operations have succeeded in similar circumstances. Nelson's not that kind of commander. For that, you need a patient, very patient officer. Nelson is the perfect officer to lead a surprise attack and assault and get it done quickly. But if that doesn't work, then Nelson doesn't have the patience. He is an excellent commander, but at this point in his career, he does not have the patience. He wants the glory. He wants the greatness. And in a bit of poetry, I suppose, he actually ends up returning to England after the operation and after the failure aboard HMS Seahorse. That vessel he did his first combat action, arriving in September 1797. He's given a hero's welcome, but he doesn't feel it's great. They blamed St. Vincent, they blamed the Secretary of War, William Wyndham, and William Pitt for his failure, not him, and to an extent they are right. They didn't give him the numbers realistically in the force to do to do an overwhelming operation. He was not going to be able to do a surprise operation because the Spanish were prepared. So realistically, the buck stops and they selected him. And the trouble is, he couldn't adapt to that circumstance. He couldn't come and go, oh, I'm not surprised them. Okay, I need to do this a long way. No, he keeps trying, hurling men and personnel at it, and it's the kind of attack where, if you're talking about a land-based siege, where they keep chucking in forlorn hopes, knowing that this one, unlike the last one, and the last one before that, and the one before that, this one will succeed. That's the kind of attack we're talking about. Luckily, this is where his career as a rear admiral ends. He managed to grow, he managed to get better. He goes to Bath with Fanny, and he managed to start getting better and better medical attention. He then hears about Duncan winning the Battle of Camperdown, and he just starts to feel better and is going, okay, we can do this. And eventually, the central ligature from his amputation site managed to fall out, and when it fell out, it hadn't been able to be removed. He started getting better. It had been infected, it had been bad, and it had been causing all sorts of issues, and it fell out. Finally, the body cut itself, and that allowed him to start to recover. It allowed him to start to heal. And he was eventually given the HMS Vanguard, another 74. He was appointed with Edward Berry as his flag captain, and he was sent out to join St. Vincent again. St. Vincent was very happy to see him. Very happy to see him. Which is why by May 1798, he's off Toulon. in command of a squadron, having been dispatched there by St. Vincent. And this is, of course, the period which leads up to the Battle of the Nile, which I've done a video on this channel for, and which should hopefully a link to it should appear here. If not, then please just search in the channel, because obviously I've managed to muck up the link. I'm trying to get better at these things, but it's not always working. It's like people keep talking about I need to improve my mic and audio, and I really do. But also the fact is that there is going to be building work done in here soon, so I'm going to be moving upstairs and all over the places in this house. So it's kind of a case of once everything's settled down, then I'll be able to invest some time in making sure the audio actually is really good, is as good as it used to be in the shed at least, which I felt was a bit better than here. Here it gets weird spikes, and I don't know why sometimes it spikes to the red. But after the glorious Battle of Nile, he then has the Neapolitan campaign, the siege of Malta, and all these things. And I will say this for him, he is once again 0 to 100 in politics, in everything. And that's what leads to his issues. That's what leads to his issues. But eventually, in 1801, he's appointed Vice Admiral. Vice Admiral of the Blue, January 1801. And that's a good thing for him. Now it's during this period that Nelson really starts to calm down, starts to develop the patience which he really needed a bit earlier in his career but didn't have. So let's see it a bit in the Nile campaign, but he still beats the French to Egypt and then turns around and goes back hunting for them again and manages to miss them. And you get something similar going on in the Trafalgar campaign. He's focused on the destruction of the enemy. He's focused on leading at the Battle of Copenhagen. He's focused in all these things on being the officer he can be. And doing what needs to be done, whether that's the daring action, or the glorious action, or the high-risk action. He does them all. He does things which fleets which, frankly, in theory shouldn't have worked out the way they did. But honestly, he's always been capable of taking the gamble and taking the risk and actually achieving something. And that's what he does. He keeps taking the gamble, taking the risk, and achieving stuff. And that's important. That's critical, really. By doing that, he's able to win. He's able to deliver the victories that Britain needs. However, his leadership style takes all of him. It consumes him. This is, I think, the reason why he has the issues when he's not in the service. He is that person who is alive when he's on the deck of a ship. When he's got the sea, the breeze, and command. When he's got the French or the Spanish or whoever in his sights and he's leading a fleet through, that is when he is alive. That is his moment. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being that way, with being a person who's only really alive when they're working, who's only really who they're meant to be when they're doing their job. There's nothing really bad about that inherently. But it does make you an unbalanced person. Not in a nasty way, just in a reality. You are an unbalanced personality. You're a personality which is happier when you're at work. There are people who completely lose everything when they're at work, become grey as anything, and then brighten up when they're out of work. And again, that's not a good way to be. You want to be a balanced personality for you, realistically, but also I think with Nelson, the balance and patience he needs, he needed to get it when he was younger. He needed to get it when he was able to grow into it and use it. He's starting to develop it through maturity, through age, but it's not coming in fast enough. He's a very good commander. He's a very decisive commander. I do not want anyone to think, and this is one of the problems when you're a historian and doing this analysis, we go, oh, this person should be, this person's perfect, or this person's terrible. And the reality is humans are always in between. Nelson is an excellent wartime commander, as an excellent decisive commander, excellent leader when it comes to motivating and bringing his people forward. Even if he was shouting, "Come on, my little Lucy's," but leave that to one side. What he isn't, though, is a rounded human being. And it's also something worthwhile thinking about, because realistically, is it that bad to not be a rounded human being? It's theoretically bad for you as a person, as an individual, because it means that if you can't do that thing anymore, that is your reason for being, you could lose the will to live. You could quite literally end up closing yourself up to life, family, opportunities, all those things, because it's not the thing you dreamed of doing. And that's bad. But for a nation, for the Royal Navy, having someone in it whose reason for living is doing exactly what you need him to do, that's a good thing. On an organizational and national and strategic level, that's a great thing. On a personal level, terrible. But on an organizational, national, and strategic level, brilliant. We love it. And that is something, again, that you sometimes have to teach to young people when they're looking up at these admirals, and they're looking up from their history and these officers, and they're going, "Wow, they're amazing, I want to be just like them." And you go, on a national level, great, we could do with you. On a personal level, as the person who's teaching you, I'd like you to be a bit more. I'd like you to be a bit more than just one thing. I'd like you to be a bit more rounded than that. I think it's better for you as a person. Because that's the thing about Nelson. He never had an after-service life. He never really had a end of service. He had gaps in service. He did, for various reasons. He had gaps in service. But he never had an after-service life. He never had a, okay, the Navy's no longer going to use you, what are you going to do with your life sort of thing. He had a service career. He had 34 years of service. He was 47 when he died. He joined the Royal Navy at 13. He never not been, as far as his, not even his adult life, in his teenage years, he was Royal Navy. And no, this is not unusual for the time. This is not unusual for the time. But this is how you build navies in this period. You are sending teenagers, practically tweenagers, off to war to learn the skills. Learn what they need to learn to go and command your fleets and fight your wars for you. And yes, we can say, well, you know, people didn't live as long in this period, and they didn't. They didn't. But still, 47 years old, 34 years of service. He's a good officer. He finishes up as a Vice Admiral the White, not a full Admiral. I have seen various people talking about him as, oh, he was a great Admiral of the Royal Navy, and he is in the generic, but when they turn around and go, yeah, he was Admiral Horatio, no, he wasn't Admiral, he was a Vice Admiral. Which is more a reflection of Britain at the time than anything else. He'd had too many public scandals that, realistically, even if he won, even after winning Trafalgar, if he'd survived, there is a debate as to whether he makes it to Admiral. There is a debate. He probably does. He probably does, but it might have been just Admiral the Blue. He might not have made it any further. I.e., not to Admiral the White, and probably not Admiral the Fleet, or Admiral the Red, depending on the period you're talking about. A good officer, though. And that being said, I want to finish this with a question, as I finish all the videos with a question. There have been videos on this channel about Trafalgar, there have been videos on this channel about Nile, there have been videos on this channel about this period going into great detail. I've often asked the question, or generally posited the question of Nelson, or Collingwood, who's a better officer today? And I would usually argue Collingwood would be a better officer for the modern Navy than Nelson, because of the way it is. But I'd like you to think about Nelson, and that's today's question. And do you think he would suit the modern armed forces? Do you think he would suit the modern world? Where would he find his place? As a leader? As a professional? As a human being? Where would he find his place? Be really interested to hear what you say. And, well, next week, it's going to be... Peter Tomskol. Victor of the Battle of Dvinken. Should be an interesting one. Not a long one, but an interesting one. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.